Hello everyone, my name is Kitty and I'm here today to share with you how I made this pair of Regency short stays, which were inspired by a pair that Daphne wears in the recent TV show Bridgerton. I of course made this pair to be much closer to a pair that Daphne wears, but you can tweak the pattern and add any changes that you like. I made this blue and white striped pair, which have wider shoulder straps, a drawstring, and a busk in the front. And something else to consider is making yourself a chemise, which will help protect you from any discomfort when wearing your stays. But I'm very hopeful my next video I'll be able to share with you how I make a Bridgerton inspired dress. I just thought it was very important to start with the right foundation and create that Regency silhouette. So let's get started.
The materials for this project will include this gray satin for both the outside and lining layer, this green cotton canvas to add a little sturdiness to the stays, some boning, some ribbon so that you can tie up the back, and then some gray velvet ribbon for bows, some matching thread. I only have this purple thread, so I'll be using that, and 4mm eyelets with my pliers. So this is the pattern I drafted for my short stays. It is made for a 30-inch under bust and about a 37-inch bust. Of course, you can add a little room to the back or front if you want to make yours a little bit larger, and you can make the bust gores a little bit smaller or larger if you have a larger or smaller bust. You can find the PDF pattern down below. It's just a copy of this pattern, but next I'm going to very quickly show you how to draft your own pair. Start by taking your measurements. You will want your bust measurement over the fullest part of your bust, your under bust measurement right underneath your bust, and then armpit to armpit across your under bust, just sort of a halfway point, and the length that you will want the stays. I usually make mine about 8 inches. Next, draw a rectangle that is as long as half of your under bust measurement and as tall as the length you want your stays to be. For example, my rectangle is 15 inches by 8 inches tall because 15 inches is half of my 30-inch under bust measurement, and I want my stays to be about 8 inches tall. Next, mark where your armpit measurement fell. For example, my armpit measurement was just half, so I marked a halfway point and drew a straight line down. That is going to separate the front piece of your stays from the back two pieces. So now about 2 inches from where you marked that armpit marking, you're going to draw a curved line, sort of a swoop. After drawing my first curved line, I like to draw a secondary one with a little gap between the two. This will be dividing my two back pieces. Next, I draw out the top edge of my stays. I want my stays to be sort of curved like Daphne's, so starting on the furthest back piece, I start dipping down and creating an armpit curve, which will sort of swoop back up to being a point where I will be adding the eyelet later. Now you don't want the curve for the armpit to be too wide or too deep. Definitely try to keep it around that armpit mark. Next, on that farthest back piece, you can start drawing your straps about 2 to 3 inches away from that back edge. You can extend this strap piece longer so that it'll reach around to the front. Next, I will be adding the position marks for my gores. I measure the first one about 2 inches away from that center front edge, and the second mark about 1 inch away from the first gore mark. And I make them about 3 to 3.5 inches long. These ones here about 3.25. But you can definitely tinker with it to find your ideal gore position. Next, I start marking where I want my boning channels to be. I usually add one boning channel in the very back against that back edge, then leave room for eyelets and a second boning channel. I also like to add 2 boning channels in the front and then 2 boning channels right under that armpit, sort of along the armpit seam. And then I add 2 to 3 boning channels diagonally from the armpit seam to more of the center front, not directly in the center front though. Keep about an inch or 2 away from that center front. Next, it is time to create the triangles that will be your bust gores for your bodice. First, create a straight line that is a little bit longer than the marks you made for the bust gores. So if the marks for your bust gores are about 3 inches long, create a line that is about 3.5 inches long. Now to figure out how wide you want the triangle tops to be of your bust gores, you're going to take the difference of your bust and under bust measurement and divide it by 4. For example, my bust measurement is 37 inches and my under bust measurement is 30 inches. That makes a difference of 7 inches. 7 inches divided by 4 is 1.75 inches. My bust gores are going to be about 1.75 inches, but I'm going to make mine 2 inches wide just so that there is a little bit of wiggle room. And there you have it. You have drafted a short stays pattern to your measurements. You can cut out the pattern and extend the straps to your desired length. And do make a mock-up before cutting into any of your nice fabric, just to double check and make any tweaks that you want. Once your pattern is ready, you can start cutting out your fabric. I like to cut out 2 layers of satin for the outside and the lining pieces and 1 layer of that cotton canvas to keep it sturdy. I start by cutting that center front piece on the fold, and I don't cut out those gore slices yet. When cutting out these pieces, I'm not leaving much seam allowance. However, I am leaving a little seam allowance on that back edge because I want it to be sturdy when completed for my back closure. And do keep in mind, you will have to cut out your gore pattern 2 times. Next, I cut out my center front, my side and back piece out of the canvas. I do not cut my gores out of the canvas. After cutting everything out, you will have 3 layers. Now go ahead and line up your 3 center front bodice pieces on top of one another and mark out where you're going to cut those slices for the gores. And then you can cut them very carefully. What we're going to do next is fold those edges under and top stitch them down. However, if necessary, you can clip the corners in just a little bit to make it easier to fold back those edges. So just go ahead and fold the pretty side of the fabric back to the wrong side, and you will top stitch it down very closely to the edge. When you reach that center point of the slice, leave the needle down in the machine and just pivot the fabric. Once both pieces of your satin are finished with the edges turned over and top stitched down, this is how they'll look. Next, we're going to insert the gores. This part can be a little bit fiddly. I like to work from the front and sometimes check it on the back. But what I do is I just pin that top edge of the gore to the right place and work that slice around the edge of the gore, making sure to leave plenty of seam allowance in the back. You're basically just going to lie the pretty side of your center front bodice on top of the gore and position it in place. Once it's in the correct place, you can go ahead and top stitch that down. You can even give it a second stitch around that gore if you want to make sure it's secure. the same thing. When I reach that bottom point of the gore, I leave the needle down in my machine and just pivot the fabric to continue the straight line. Once your gores are inserted, you can decide which of the two pieces is not as cute and make it your lining side. You will be matching up the canvas to your lining. Start by folding those edges along the gores under. You'll be folding the edges of your canvas towards the lining and pinning them in place. Then you can top stitch your canvas down to your lining piece all along those gore edges. Now we can start putting the stays together, starting with the lining. Go ahead and take a piece of satin and match it to a piece of canvas. And you're going to pin the straight edges of those side pieces to the straight edge of your center front of the bodice. Once pinned in place, you can go ahead and sew those down. Afterwards, take that seam allowance created from the stitch and fold it over towards the front and stitch it down. That will reinforce the seam. That way there's not as much tension pulled on it when you're wearing the stays. Next, we're going to add the back piece to our stays. But first, I like to lie the satin on top of the canvas and stitch around all of the edges except for the bottom edge, just to match that top piece of lining to the canvas because the straps can be a little bit fiddly. This will help keep it in place. Now you can match together the back piece to the side piece all along the curve. Go very slowly and use pins as you work. Once finished, you can sew these pieces together and then fold over that seam allowance towards the back and stitch it down as well. Now we can go ahead and assemble the layer that will be the visible side of our stays. As you work, be sure to keep your seam allowances the same. That way one piece doesn't end up bigger than the other. After you have finished assembling your outside layer of your stays, you can go ahead and match your two stays together, pretty sides touching. You're going to want to be very slow and methodical as you work and use lots of pins, matching up the gores, matching up the straps, and just working around the side and top edge of the entire stays. Once you have these two layers pinned together, you're going to sew along the side edge, the entirety of the straps, and the top edge of the stays. You may also consider reinforcing this stitch all along these edges. Next, I just trimmed these edges, cleaning them up a bit. And if needed, you may want to clip a few curves just to make it a little easier when we turn it inside out. Because I made the straps quite narrow on my stays, it was very slow to turn it inside out, but with patience and some tools, you can turn it inside out. Afterwards, you may want to iron down the edges, and then we're just going to top stitch all along those edges, securing it in place. Now we're going to create boning channels. I like to start by adding 3 straight rows of stitches to the back edges of my stays. 2 rows will be for boning and the row in between will be for the eyelets. Next, with both layers pinned together, I mark where I want my 2 rows of boning to be for the center front of my bodice. I stitch those in place and then reference my pattern to figure out where I want those diagonal rows of boning to be. And I just very carefully mark where I want them to be. Then following my marks, I just create 4 rows of straight stitches to create 3 boning channels. Once the boning channels are finished, it's time to insert the boning. I like to insert the boning in between the lining, which should be the lining layer and canvas, and then the outside layer. That way I have the canvas layer against my skin to protect me from any rubbing of the boning. I then reference the boning channels and figure out about how long I want my boning strips to be, cut them, and then insert them into the boning channels. You of course can file down the edges of your pieces of boning, that way they also won't poke you. Once your boning has been inserted, it's time to create a finished edge for the bottom of your stays. Cut a strip of fabric that is about 2 inches wide and about 2 inches longer than the total length of your stays. Pin the pretty side of that strip of fabric to the lining side of your stays. When you reach the edges, fold the edges back and pin that down as well. Once everything has been pinned together, you can straight stitch along that bottom edge. After stitching that strip of fabric in place, you're going to fold your stays over and pull that strip of fabric over the raw bottom edge of your stays. You're going to now fold the raw edge of that strip of fabric under and then fold that on top of the bottom of your stays and pinning it in place. This strip of fabric is going to be like a piece of faux bias tape and will finish and cover the raw edges of the bottom of your stays. Now it's time to add eyelets to the back edges of my stays. I of course first measure down and mark where I want each eyelet to be. It may be wiser to add eyelets before adding the boning and finishing off the bottom edge, but I was confident my 4mm eyelets would fit in the channel I created, so do be sure to leave enough room for your eyelets. So as you can see, I use scissors to cut a hole where I've marked where I want my eyelet to be. I then insert the eyelet and use my pliers to clamp it shut. This is a really great tool for adding eyelets. There are also some eyelets that have a washer, and I really prefer those. Of course, with quarantine, I had to use these 4mm eyelets that I had on hand. After inserting eyelets on the back edge, I added eyelets to the straps and the front of my stays. And once your eyelets have been inserted, your stays are completed. All you need is ribbon to be able to tie the back of your stays and perhaps create cute bows on the front where your straps attach to the front of your stays. So now let's try them on and see how they fit. I of course can put them on by myself, and you will see them worn here with a chemise.
And thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see a video how I make a Bridgerton inspired dress to go with my short stays, please like and subscribe. I will also be sharing other fun DIY videos. So again, thank you so much for watching. Bye!